This is one of the biggest properties I've worked on recently, with 60 metres of bluestone pathway and reclaimed brick edging going in. And somewhere in the research for this one, I found out this suburb was legally dry for 90 years. No pubs, no alcohol, nothing. But life finds a way. We'll get to that. This property runs deep, from the front garden all the way to the back. I'm going to be installing around 60 metres of bluestone pathway, large natural edge steppers, each one set individually on mortar. The whole thing will be bordered with reclaimed old red bricks and finished off with Tuscan toppings. As usual, I'll be working solo. Let's see if I've got enough left in the tank for this one. What could go wrong? First things first, I'll set up some string lines to see the levels. I want the path to run flat through this section. I'm not alone out here though. This property has 4 chickens. They stopped laying a while back, but that doesn't seem to bother anyone, least of all the chickens. They follow the digging because they know exactly what it means. Every time I start digging, they're there. Worms, grubs, beetles, whatever the ground gives up, they're onto it before it has a chance to go anywhere. They've worked out that a landscaper with a shovel is worth following. One of them in particular seems to have strong opinions about where the work should be happening, and isn't shy about making that known. Backyard chickens used to be completely normal in suburbs like this. Through the Depression and through both World Wars, a few chooks in the backyard wasn't a statement about sustainable living, it was just how a household ran. They provided eggs, fertilizer, and pest control. Suburbs like this one in the 1940s were still close enough to their farming origins that nobody thought twice about it. Then post-war Australia decided what a proper suburban backyard was supposed to look like. Neat lawn, garden beds around the edges, a hills hoist. Chickens didn't fit, they were messy. They scratched things up and they made noise at inconvenient times. So slowly they disappeared from most Melbourne backyards, and keeping them went from being practical to being slightly eccentric. Then, somewhere in the last 20 years, they came back. The sustainability movement, the interest in knowing where food comes from, the general suspicion of supermarket eggs, all played a role in this, and backyard chickens started appearing in Melbourne gardens again. The chickens never really changed. They just kept scratching around, laying eggs, and fertilizing whatever soil they were in. The city just came back around to them. Sounds like our bricks have arrived. These reclaimed old red bricks are going in as the edging along both sides of the path. The edging is what gives a path like this its definition. It holds everything in place, draws the line between the Tuscan toppings and the garden beds, between the path and the lawn. Without it, you just have a strip of gravel in a garden. And red brick alongside bluestone. There's something about that combination that just works. The warmth of the red against the cool dark of the blue. They've been used together in Melbourne for 150 years, and they still look right. Some things just do. The whole path will sit on a compacted crushed rock base. It drains well and gives the bluestone and brick something solid to sit on that won't move. The front sections of this path are going to be curved. To get a curve that looks natural rather than forced, I'm laying out a hose and adjusting it until the line looks right to my eye, then marking it in with spray paint. You could also use a power cord for this. Once you're happy with one side, you can use a tape measure to get the exact curve for the other side. Just measure out the width of the path using your painted line as a guide. I also sometimes mark up a stick or broom handle with the width and use that instead. You'll see me do exactly that a bit later on. And here comes the main event. In these crates are 70 large bluestone steppers. These will be the spine of this path. Before the crushed rock goes down, I'm going to put some landscaping fabric over the scoria. It keeps the layers separate and lets water pass straight through and into the buried drain beneath. This entire garden is covered in Kikuyu, and if you're not familiar, it's a type of grass, though calling it a grass is a bit like calling a crocodile a lizard. Technically accurate, but leaves out the important part. Kikuyu comes from the highlands of East Africa. It's named after the Kikuyu people of Kenya, who had deep agricultural knowledge of the plant and used it as livestock feed for generations. It evolved at elevation with warm days, cool nights, unpredictable rainfall, and long dry spells. These harsh conditions shaped it into something that's extraordinarily resilient and very hard to get rid of. It developed two separate systems for spreading. Above ground, it sends out stolons, which are runners that travel horizontally across the surface, rooting as they go. Below ground, it spreads through rhizomes, an underground network of stems pushing outward in all directions simultaneously. It doesn't need to flower to spread. It doesn't need ideal conditions. It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear, and it absolutely will not stop. Australia was one of the first countries to bring it in. The first seeds arrived in 1908 from the Congo. They were actually intercepted by customs because the package came in with no label and no documentation. It was completely unmarked. A local botanist grew the seeds just to identify what they were, and once he did, he was apparently impressed enough to collaborate with Australian universities to help establish it across the country as pasture and fodder grass. It was introduced to solve a problem. It then became a different problem, depending on who you ask. By mid-century, Kikuyu was in lawns all over Melbourne. It's hard-wearing, drought-tolerant, recovers fast from damage, and stays reasonably green through winter when a lot of other warm-season grasses give up entirely. For a busy family backyard, it has a lot going for it. The issue is that it doesn't really recognize boundaries. It will cross a garden edge, infiltrate a bed, travel under a path, and come up on the other side. Greenskeepers at golf courses spend serious money and time trying to remove it from areas where it doesn't belong, the greens, the fairways, the fine turf zones, while simultaneously managing the rough, which in some courses is Kikuyu. The same grass, just in the wrong place. Digging it out before a job like this is not a quick process. You're not just clearing the surface. You're following the root mass down, pulling runners, trying to get as much of the rhizome network out as possible before the crushed rock base goes in. Because if you don't, it'll find its way back. It will come up through gravel. It will work along the edge of a path for years, looking for a gap. Given enough time, it will find one. The only way to get rid of it is by carefully digging out all the roots, and 60% of the time, this method works every time. When I'm on a job like this, I like to find something interesting about the area. It gives the work a bit of context. So I looked into the history of Balwyn North, and I have to be honest with you, there isn't much. Farms, then houses. Dairy farms, then a tram line, then more houses. For a suburb that prides itself on being one of Melbourne's most desirable postcodes, Balwyn North has had a remarkably uneventful history. And it's not even really its own place history-wise. It's just the area north of Balwyn, which was named after someone else's vineyard. So Balwyn North is so historically unremarkable that it couldn't even come up with its own name. The only two cultural highlights I could find were these. In 1961, the first Coles supermarket in Australia was built here. And in the early 1950s, John Brack, one of my favourite Australian artists, painted the North Balwyn tram terminus while living nearby. Brack went on to paint Collins Street 5 p.m, which is probably the most recognised Australian painting of the 20th century. So, to summarise the cultural highlights of Balwyn North, a supermarket and a painting of a tram stop. The tram stop painting is genuinely beautiful, for what it's worth. I did find something worth talking about though. In 1928, temperance campaigners turned the area into a dry zone. No pubs, no bottle shops, no alcohol, full stop. The local Protestant churches lobbied hard for it, and they got it. If you lived here and wanted a drink, you had to leave. That's a strange thing for a suburb to do on its own, so I went looking into why. And that's where this story gets genuinely good. Go back to 1916. Victoria, along with most of the rest of the country, brought in something called 6 o'clock closing. Pubs had to shut at 6 p.m. The idea, pushed hard by the temperance movement, was that if people had less time to drink, they'd drink less. It was meant to be a war austerity measure, and it stuck around for 50 years. It didn't really work the way anyone planned though. What it actually created was the 6 o'clock swill. Picture this. You knock off work at 5, you've got 1 hour. So does everyone else. So the entire male workforce of a city pours straight into the pub and tries to drink as much beer as humanly possible before the doors shut. The pubs were packed, wall to wall with standing room only. Men with one elbow on the bar, shouting over each other's heads to get served. It was, by every account, absolute chaos. And here's a detail I love. If you've been to Melbourne, you've probably walked past 100 old pubs and noticed a band of ceramic tiles running around the outside walls, 5 or 6 feet up from the footpath. That's not just decoration, although it does that job too. Those tiles went in because the pub needed to be hosed down at the end of the night. 6 o'clock closing meant an hour of absolute carnage, and then everyone poured out onto the street at once. Beer, spills, and worse. The glazed tiles washed down a lot easier than bare bricks did. So the next time you're standing outside an old pub, look down. You're looking at architecture that was built to deal with how Melbourne used to drink. Women, by the way, weren't really part of this scene at all. Through this whole era, pubs ran a public bar for men and a separate ladies' lounge with its own entrance, sometimes its own toilet, and was kept well away from the swill. This painting by John Brack, called The Bar, captures the scene perfectly. Women could serve drinks in the public bar, they just weren't allowed to drink there as a customer. In some states, it was actually illegal for a woman to be served a drink in a public bar. In Queensland, in 1965, 2 women, Merle Thornton and Rosalie Bogner, chained themselves to the footrail of a Brisbane pub in protest. The police were called, but decided they weren't willing to remove them on camera and told them to have a good night and don't drink too much. The protest made international headlines, and the law changed 5 years later. The bar where it happened is now called Merle's Bar. Merle Thornton was also, for what it's worth, the mother of Australian actress Sigrid Thornton. Which brings us back to Balwyn North. In the middle of all of this, the swill, the tiled pubs, the segregated bars, a suburb full of church-going young families looked at the whole mess and said, "Not here." They voted themselves dry in 1928 and stayed that way for the better part of 90 years. And here's the bit I really like. Balwyn North is named after Balwyn, and Balwyn means home of the vine. The man who founded the suburb literally planted a vineyard on this land in the 1850s. Within 2 generations, the place had banned alcohol entirely. So the home of a vine became the home of absolutely nothing you could drink. It wasn't until 2015 that Balwyn North's dry zone was finally lifted, 90 years later. The most exciting thing to happen here in living memory is that you're now legally allowed to buy a beer. So, that's the history of Balwyn North. A suburb with not a lot to write home about historically, sitting right in the middle of one of the funniest periods of Australian drinking history, having decided to have absolutely nothing to do with any of it, while ironically being named after a vineyard. Whether the boring history and the dry zone are connected, I'll leave for you to decide. With the brick edging in, the middle of the path needs to come up a bit. The Bluestone steppers are a very different thickness to the bricks, so to avoid having to make up the height difference with a crazy amount of mortar, I'm going to use a bit more crushed rock to get the levels right. There's a question worth asking when you're working with a stone like this, which is, how did it get here? I don't mean to this property specifically, we just watched it come off a truck, but how did it get to the point where it's the thing people ask for? Bluestone was formed by volcanic activity across the western plains of Victoria, from lava flows and eruptions that happened over millions of years, some as recently as 10,000 years ago, which is close enough to the present that early Aboriginal people in the region almost certainly witnessed some of it. The stone that's sitting on this garden today started as molten rock, moving across a landscape that looked nothing like it does now. When Melbourne was being built in earnest through the 1840s and 50s, Bluestone was the obvious choice for construction. It was everywhere, quarried in Footscray, Clifton Hill, Coburg, Brunswick, and all through the inner suburbs that sat on top of the basalt plain. It was harder than most alternatives, resistant to weathering, and there was an enormous amount of it just below the surface. It went into the buildings, the bridges, the jail, the gutters and curving of the city streets, the foundations of some of Melbourne's most famous sandstone buildings, Parliament House, the Treasury, the Town Hall, a bluestone underneath. The grand facades were limestone and sandstone, but the thing holding them up was bluestone. The quarrying itself is also worth a moment. Early bluestone quarrying was done by hand. Workers hammered wedges into natural cracks in the rock to split it, then roughly squared the blocks with a knapping hammer before loading them onto horse-drawn carts and hauling them to site. By the 1850s, they were using explosives, drilling holes, packing them with black powder, and lighting the fuse. The person who placed and lit the explosives was called the powder monkey, traditionally the highest paid and most dangerous role in the quarry. Many men were killed or injured doing the job. It was very much a buy the ticket, take the ride kind of deal. As the bluestone I'm using here was cut by machines, the surfaces are incredibly smooth. To make sure they stick to the mortar and don't pop off, I put a primer directly onto the stone before laying them. I use a mix of bonding agent, cement and water mixed into a paste, then use a small paint roller to apply it. A significant amount of the quarrying was done by convict labour. Quarries at Clifton Hill were worked by prisoners from the Collingwood Stockade. Pentridge Prison in Coburg was built from bluestone quarried on site by the prisoners themselves. They built their own jail. The site where they quarried it has since been turned into Coburg Lakes, where people now go for Sunday afternoon picnics. If you look carefully at bluestone blocks in Melbourne's laneways, you'll sometimes see marks scratched into the surface. Those are convict identification marks. Labourers scratched their initials into the stones they'd cut so they could be credited for the work. The stone remembers things the city has long since moved on from. And then, by the 1880s, Melbourne decided it was over it. Bluestone had started to feel like the wrong material for a city trying to project confidence and prosperity. It was dark and heavy. It was associated with the convict era, a past the city was actively trying to move away from. Fashionable buildings started getting faced with lighter stone, or rendered over entirely. Sandstone and granite became the prestige choices. Bluestone got pushed to the edges, the landways, the back streets, the infrastructure you used without noticing. It stayed in that position for a long time, still everywhere underneath the city, still in the curbs and gutters, still in the laneways running behind the terraces, but not chosen, not sought out. It was regarded as something to be hidden rather than celebrated. What changed is harder to pin down precisely, but somewhere in the second half of the 20th century, the laneways of Melbourne stopped being the back of the city and started being something people actually sought out. The dark stone, the texture, the sense of age, what had felt oppressive started feeling like character. Cafes and bars opened in lanes. Street art appeared on bluestone walls. The very quality that made bluestone feel heavy and forbidding became the thing that made it feel like Melbourne. It's in the laneways tourists photograph. It's in the gardens of houses like this one. It's on the mood boards of landscape designers and architects across the city. It's once again celebrated like it always should have been. It's the stone that built Melbourne. It's our stone. I've laid a lot of bluestone over the years. It still has a weight to it that most materials don't, and I don't just mean physically, though it has that too. These steppers are all very different shapes, which means the focus is in the spacing and the layout. There's also a catch with these, because the rock is sliced, the stones cut next to each other end up very similar in shape. Put two of those next to each other in the path, and it looks wrong immediately. So, part of the job is separating the shapes and distributing them across 60 meters so the whole thing reads as natural rather than repetitive. Get it right, and it looks like it was always supposed to be there. The first thing you notice is how orange the Tuscan toppings looks. It's almost alarming. But once it gets wet, it settles right down and the true colour comes through. And when you look closely, it's not just one colour at all. There are blues, greys, pinks, creams. It's a whole mix of crushed stone in there. The orange is just the first impression. Toppings hold moisture, which is fine in the middle of a path, but not ideal sitting directly against a building. So before the toppings go in along the wall, I'm running a strip of thick plastic damp course along the base. This creates a barrier between the toppings and the stone. I'm about 4 barrow loads short. Nothing dramatic, but I'll have to come back tomorrow to finish off the last section. It wouldn't be a proper job without at least one trip back anyway. Like my little feathered friends on this job, I'm no spring chicken anymore. My mind and body are starting to ask for a rest. For once, I'm actually going to listen and take a couple of weeks off. And this has got absolutely nothing to do with any good surf that may or may not be happening. Thanks for watching. I really do appreciate all the comments you guys leave. Honestly, thank you. I'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Bye for now.